Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. Thank you for joining today's program, Remembering AIDS Action Now in Toronto. My name is Julio Capo, and I'm an associate professor of history and public humanities at FIU in Miami. And today we're very lucky to be joined by my friend and colleague, Tom Hooper. Hey, Tom, how's it going?
I'm doing well, Leo. Thank you for having me here. I'm really excited to be here and to be here in South Florida as well.
Thanks for joining us. Uh, a little introduction, which barely scratches the surface to all of Tom Hooper's work. Tom Hooper is a historian of LGBTQ Toronto and history and an assistant professor at York University in Toronto. Most recently, his work has focused on the 1981 Toronto bathhouse raids. In particular, he has been conducting extensive research on the community that resisted and fought back against those raids and beyond state violence. And as I noted, that barely scratches the surface of his work as a historian, as a public historian, and as a community-based scholar. Thanks again, Tom, for joining us.
My
So
pleasure to be here.
before we get going, I'd like to thank our sponsors for today's talk. Today's event is being held by the Miami AIDS Memorials Project, which I'll talk about just shortly, in just a few seconds, but with support from the Wilsonian Public Humanities Lab, WPHL at FIU. So just a little bit about what we do at the Miami AIDS Memorials Project, and a little shout out to my colleagues and the other co-leads of that project, Dudley Alexis and Dan Royals. We, the Miami AIDS Memorial Project, have existed for a little over a year now, funded by Monument Lab, a generous grant from them. We're working to preserve, commemorate, and help to tell the multifaceted stories of HIV/AIDS in Miami. This is an intersecting story, of course. It's why we are the Memorials, that is plural, project. The history of HIV/AIDS in Miami, of course, is a story of anti-Blackness, of anti-immigrant fervor, of class warfare and other forms of inequities and sexism and homophobia and transphobia and so on and so forth. And we acknowledge that and are trying to get as much feedback from the community as possible to think about the multiple ways that we can commemorate these nuanced stories. At this stage of this work, we're hosting a number of different sessions that help introduce people to the multiple ways that folks have commemorated HIV/AIDS stories across space and time. And today we're getting another example of that with Tom Hooper's work. I'm going to add a link to the chat for folks who are watching this and joining us later to possibly get involved with Miami AIDS Memorials Project, including a crowdsourcing digital archive we are working on. We're asking for folks to help us out by tagging folks that you might see in photos and information of those photos of Miami's historic White Party. That's the iconic HIV/AIDS fundraiser that began in 1985 and ended in 2010 with Vizcaya Museum and Gardens, one of our other community partners. You can contribute by helping to tag photographs from the White Party and support this effort. I'm going to also include some social media stuff so you can join us and follow us there. Um, but now to our main event with Tom Hooper. Tom, there's so many questions I want to ask you, but first I just want to ask, tell us a little bit about how you got into this work more generally.
I think like a lot of queer historians and LGBTQ scholars, it's my foray into examining groups like AIDS Action Now has been, very tentative. I've always been a little bit scared to do this kind of work, and a lot of that has to do with, my own personal experiences, which I think a lot of people in our community can resonate with. The first experience I ever had with dealing with death, going to a funeral, was my Uncle John, John Hooper, who died of HIV/AIDS in 1994. And his death and the way I saw it affect my family, but also all of his friends that showed up to that funeral, has had a lifelong effect on me. When I went to do my undergrad and I started becoming a historian in training, I started getting into doing oral histories, and I had an opportunity in my third year to do this project on my uncle, where I, got to tell his story in this essay and sort of contextualize it within this emerging community in Toronto. As part of that, I interviewed my grandmother. and got to hear her perspective, which is really, heart-wrenching for a mother to have lost her son, and also under the conditions in which it happened. My uncle faced a lot of hardship in the house, a lot of homophobia, was kicked out, and so um, it was a really, sort of difficult essay for me to write. And ever since then, I vowed, I'm like, I'm never going to talk about HIV/AIDS activism. It's too hard for me to do. At the same time, as I've become, I guess, a more mature historian, I realize, we actually have a responsibility to this history. We can't just forget about it because it's too hard, because so many of us have been deeply impacted by this work. I mean, who in our community hasn't been impacted by HIV/AIDS? So I think I'm now trying to get back into it to overcome or maybe not overcome, overcome's the wrong word, but to like really incorporate, this pain and this grief into the work, to inspire the work, to inform the work. I don't think we should shy away from it. It's real, and it's been really an important part of the foundation of our community since the 1980s.
Well said, and thank you for sharing that story. I'm sure on some level, so many people can that resonates and strikes a chord with so many different folks. Because you're right. I mean, no matter what, right? Like it's to me, it's always one of my favorite things that ACT UP used to say is that no matter what, we are all living with AIDS, right? That is like to understand that this is something that affects us all in ways that sometimes people don't even anticipate or perhaps even acknowledge. But as you were talking about that, one of the first things that comes to my mind too is just that it also provides an opportunity, the grief and the violence and all these difficult stories also provide a space for healing, right? Like that's also a key way of thinking through that.
Yeah, I really like that idea, that approach. It's, healing the history, it's healing our community, and it's healing ourselves. As difficult as the work has been, and, listening back to my grandmother who left us in 2007, it's tough work. And to sort of relive all of that, but to also understand the importance of this history, the fact that people like my uncle aren't forgotten. He's remembered. And there's a healing in that. And that takes work, and it takes, really trying to plow through and incorporate this grief into our work. So yeah, healing, definitely a big part of this work. And I'm very thankful I've been getting into it.
Thank you for that. And thank you for I'm sure he's really proud. Um Oof, that was a lot. Tom, tell us a little bit about AIDS Action Now. Tell us how it fits into the history of AIDS activism more generally. For folks who might not be aware, let them know about the history of AIDS Action Now.
But there's a longer history of like the emergence of a LGBTQ community in Toronto that predates HIV/AIDS, and as you kind of mentioned, I'm a historian of the bathhouses, so there was always already this kind of activist community that existed. By the time we had our first cases of HIV coming to Canada in 1982 and 1983, the community formed this organization called the AIDS Committee of Toronto, ACT. And this was an organization that was really designed to try to work collaboratively with government institutions, community leaders, and other groups in order to try to provide, services to people who were living with this disease. The issue, though, is the AIDS Committee of Toronto was very much tied into, political systems within the federal government, within the city government. They were tied into sort of the respectable leadership. That was the game they were playing. This was a little bit infuriating for a lot of the people who were living and also dying of AIDS, that they felt the clock was ticking. There was a little bit too much sucking up going on, and not enough action that was taking place. So in 1988, 5 years after the AIDS Committee of Toronto was formed, AIDS Action Now came together as this more activist group, a group that would deny any and all state funding. They would not apply for grants. They wouldn't accept state or corporate money because they believed this would compromise what they were trying to do. So AIDS Action Now is really the creation of a much more radical and a much more confrontational style of activism in order to really assert the urgency of the moment in that time in 1988. There's some benefits to, working governments and getting those grants. We do need organizations to do that. It's not like AIDS Action Now was like, AIDS Committee of Toronto, you're our enemy. It was just they felt there was a particular need in this moment to have a two-pronged approach. You've got one group working within, and then you have this other group that's going to push for, greater care, greater treatment, prevention, a cure, and then the community supports that people living with AIDS and their families and friends needed for their day-to-day lives. Canada has its own unique experience with HIV AIDS, and the activism takes a unique shape as well. Canada has universal health care, which is a big distinction between Canada and the US. It's one of the reasons why Canada feels so proud of itself a lot. There are problems with universal health care, but we tend to really like this thing. At the same time, this produces a really unique terrain of activism when you're trying to push for greater care and greater treatment. Uh, for our experience in Ontario and in Canada, really the government was a very central role and a very central target in terms of directly making these changes because the government was in charge of all of this stuff. So, yeah, I think the history of the AIDS Committee Toronto, but also this group that we're talking about today, AIDS Action Now. There's a lesson to be learned here about different terrains of activism, different tactics of activism, and how maybe it's useful when you've got some people within and some people working without.
So fascinating. And I thought you explained that so well. And I think it is so generative to think about it in these times, but also at any time, certainly. But to think about this, I like the way you phrased it, this kind of two-prong approach, because that's, it also holds the government accountable in a way that you would find much more difficult to do with if you're essentially a part of the state, right? And kind of beholden to the state, and in that way, kind of allows you to a different space to push back and to hold accountable.
That's the key word, accountable. And like AIDS Action Now was in many respects community holding community accountable, making sure that the people who were working within weren't working to sell us out. And that's sort of the really particular aspect of AIDS Action Now and the voice that they brought to activism within the city and within the country.
Well said. There's so many questions I want, but I'm gonna, but I also, one of the things I find so important about your work, is that in addition to being, of course, a historian of the LGBTQ experience writ large, you're also certainly an urban historian and a, community-based scholar, among many, many other things. So I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about, you started telling us a little bit about the peculiarities and the distinctiveness of, being in Toronto and being in Canada and to think about transcending borders in this way, but to think about how AIDS Action Now was felt in Toronto. How did the work it did shape the city and the lives of those people who, lived in it and traversed it more broadly?
Um, Yeah, I mean, I think there's a long history of LGBTQ people in Toronto creating their communities, creating their spaces. This goes all the way back to the late 19th century. And so there's a really long history here, but it was really in the 1970s where we saw the emergence of this loud activist kind of community that really wanted to push the envelope of sexual liberation. And they really used the geography of the city to their advantage, both in terms of their creation of community, but also in terms of their activism and resistance. So, I think about my work on the bathhouse raids. Initially, gay bathhouses, they didn't exist. It was just bathhouses in general where people would show up to actually take a bath. And the space itself, it lended itself to, LGBTQ people meeting each other, gay men being able to meet each other in private and secret. And eventually, as this community emerged in the 1970s, they saw, okay, we can use this to our advantage. They took the urban rents and all of these properties that were available that could be easily converted into these kind of spaces, and they did that. Um, and they also, in terms of building bathhouses as these really important spaces of community, it meant that by the time HIV/AIDS came on the scene, after police raids, I guess I should tell you, we haven't actually addressed what the bathhouse raids are, have we? These bathhouses were created in the 1970s, and on February 5th, 1981, 200 police agents raided four of these gay bathhouses and arrested over 300 men in one night. It's one of the largest mass arrests in Canadian history. And so the community that had been emerging through the 1970s, this activist, politicized community, they were ready to fight back. This group called the Right to Privacy Committee, they took to the streets, they raised money, they found gay-friendly lawyers to defend them. And so they really used the resources that they had available in the city of Toronto to their advantage. This movement, where you have thousands of people marching through the streets, demanding protections for bathhouses in 1981, this meant that the bathhouses were sacred spaces. This moment showed that the community cared about these spaces, that they were central, and that we were ready and willing to defend our spaces. So when HIV and AIDS came to the city and really took hold, there were a lot of conversations across the continent about, what do you do with spaces like gay bathhouses, cruising spots, gay bars? How do you handle this within the context of HIV/AIDS? And there are some places like San Francisco where it was like, okay, we're closing these spaces. Bye, you're gone. You have to shut them down. But in Toronto, we had sort of this unique experience because of the bathhouse raids and the central place of these businesses in our community. Bathhouses were seen as an opportunity, not as a threat. This is a space where we can actually do direct STI, HIV testing. We can talk about treatment and prevention. We can provide condoms. There are all sorts of things that can happen within a bathhouse that actually are productive in terms of this fight against HIV/AIDS. So some of these more radical moments and these more activist moments, this fed into the creation of the Action Now, the organization AIDS Action Now. This idea that we can't sit idly by, that we have a responsibility to fight back and to defend our communities. AIDS Action Now is directly coming from that history of the city where our community was, they were ready and they knew what to do. So, yeah, I think that's sort of the uniqueness of the city of Toronto, but also the way in which the urban environment allowed them to really fight back here.
This is so fast. I've heard you talk about parts of your research before, of course, but hearing you now talk about it in this context actually opens so many different routes for me that I find exciting. Because you're right, like one of the ways that we normally think about bathhouses in the context of HIV/AIDS is almost always about the debates about whether they should be closed or not, right? Like that is like, does as a kind of public health concern and whether or not. But, and the case of Toronto in particular in this case reshapes that narrative and really challenges that narrative in ways that I think, quite frankly, is true of so many other spaces, but it's so clear seen in Toronto, where these were also always community spaces where people came together. But you see the actual mobilization in no unclear terms happen because as a result of the bathhouse raids. And that way, it's a kind of precursor for the activism that's to come, the way that people might have imagined, I don't in like South Florida, Anita Bryant or something, but there's like this moment of mobilization that's political, that's social, that's cultural, that's certainly economic. That's so fascinating.
And they become, I guess, for lack of a better word, veterans of being radical protesters,
Yeah.
and they have this experience under them. So, when the AIDS Committee of Toronto was formed, their organizational constitution, their structure, everything about them was a direct mirror of the Right to Privacy Committee that was created to fight back against the bathhouse raids. The same working groups, almost the same people, like almost exactly the same person. The chair of the Right to Privacy Committee became the chair of AIDS Action Now. AIDS Action Now as well took on the same similar constitution. And the idea of like, how do we get thousands of people into the streets? How do we organize an effective protest? AIDS Action Now is really continuing this, I want to say, proud history that we have in Toronto.
It's fascinating. Also, for this is just selfish. I want folks to do more work on privacy because I find it's a language of the era that's so significant, and like like people like David Minto have started doing, well, have for a while kind of traced it back to from the UK, these transnational moments of what it means to have right to privacy. Obviously, its origins in abortion debates in the Americas, but that is like, it was an effective strategy, privacy as a concept, that was really utilized by the 70s and 80s in massive ways that people may not read as radical, but could be very radical. And that is, it's always kind of relative of what radical means, depending on the kind of context in which it emerges. It's so fascinating. Um, so I have to ask the question about commemoration and the ways that we think about, almost like kind of shifting to humanities and public history. But the work you do, not only is it incredibly impactful for those who have passed, but also those who are living. So to really, as all history is, right? But your project deals with memory in so many key ways. So I guess I want to ask you how histories are remembered, they're commemorated and preserved, or not remembered or commemorated or preserved. What is the legacy of AIDS action now today? Why is it so important for us to tell and preserve this history today? Perhaps more than ever, or whatever, whatever that looks like, but to tell us about the public memory of it all.
I this it's so important to have these public commemorations and these projects that are designed to really reclaim histories that have been forgotten. I think it's so important that we do this. I mean, I just, I've talked about my Uncle John earlier, but his name is on the AIDS Memorial in Toronto. We have a memorial garden, and there's several pillars that have the names engraved on plaques based on the year in which they died. And there's about 12 pillars, and so many names on these. And I remember going to that park and walking through the list and getting to 1994 and seeing my uncle's name there, and seeing John David Charles Thomas Hooper staring at me, and that meant so much to me, that his name is there, and he's part of this community that continues, that will be remembered. That is so important. Just that healing thing that we talked about at the start of this talk. So, so important. So that commemoration aspect means so much to people personally. But I also think it's important politically. We have to talk about, we have to commemorate this stuff because we have to remember how to resist. We have to, and especially with regard to this topic, learning about communities who are facing, intense grief, facing intense marginalization and insurmountable odds. How do they create spaces in which their voices are going to be heard? So telling that story and providing that instruction for our future struggles is so important. It's one of our central jobs, I think, as LGBTQ historians. And the problem is, too often, especially when it comes to HIV/AIDS, this history of resistance is forgotten. I mean, we have great histories of it, and I don't want to downplay those, and especially histories that have been written by AIDS activists themselves based on their own experiences. Those are so rich. But I mean, in terms of sort of our general approach and how we remember the past, so much of this history gets forgotten. And it's something that historians need to always keep in mind that history isn't always about remembering things. It's also about the things that are forgotten. We make choices to remember things, and in the process, things are also being left out. So this has impeded research on organizations like the AIDS Committee of Toronto or groups like AIDS Action Now, because people don't want to do this kind of work. It's too hard, it's too difficult. And also, death is a big factor in terms of that process of forgetting. Yes, researchers have chosen different topics based on grief, but also we have huge gaps in the history because people with their memories and their experiences and their archives have died before we've been able to capture them. So we've lost the whole community archive of oral histories. And so that's why it's really important that we undertake this kind of work. The organization that is sorry, can you remind me the name? The
Miami AIDS Memorials Project.
Thank you.
Got it.
Sorry.
You're good. You're good.
My brain is mush. I forgot my sponsor. Yeah, we're really doing that work and identifying the memorials and really speaking to the importance of them is really, really important. And recapturing oral histories, doing that oral history work, doing those interviews, so central to that work of reclaiming that past.
Thank you so much for that. And as you were saying that, one of the things that came, and by the way, parts of that gave me goosebumps, like when this kind of note, but like, it's also not just forgetting or not commemorating, it's also systemic erasure, right? Like, I mean, and that's one of the dangers that I think we have here is that doing this kind of work can also feel prohibitive. Like, I mean, that is, it sometimes is prohibited in certain spaces and increasingly under greater attack. And so that is, it's perhaps more, it's not just the risk of being forgotten, it's also just the systemic erasure of the work that who's to say that the research we do uncover today isn't erased done. So it's continuously, it's a project and in perpetuity. Since you mentioned it, Tom, I would love to, such a big part of this recovery work, of this detective work, of this, the work of the historian, is about creating new archives, right? That is especially through oral history and testimony. So if you can just tell us the role of oral history, the kind of work you've done more generally in oral history, and the role that oral history is, plays in your research and why it's so important, to get us thinking about the forms of recovery and the significance of it.
In Toronto, LGBTQ history has always been held by our community. We have our community archives. It used to be called the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives. It's now called the Archives with a Q. So some people call it archives because of its spelling, but in any case, it's also called Canada's Queer Archives. And this houses one of the largest collection of LGBTQ community histories in the world. It's massive, and they have two sites. They're both packed to the gills with boxes, and then they have off-site storage that you have to order the stuff, and they'll deliver it in a week, that kind of thing. So it's huge. It's massive. Despite this, there are still huge gaps. I mean, for my work on the bathhouse raids, I have access in the archives to the very detailed minutes of the Right to Privacy Committee, where every meeting was thoroughly captured within these very detailed minutes. I got all the tea of the drama of these activists and the ordeals they went through. So that's a rich, rich history that we can really rely on. But it's a huge that's a small piece of the puzzle in terms of telling this history of the bathhouse raids. The people who were there that night, who were on the receiving end of that police violence and that brutality. We're never really going to be able to know their stories unless we speak to them, unless we hear from them, unless we are able to access their archives. So there's only so much that you can get within an archive, and so even an organization like the Queer Archives in Canada, we still have to do this oral history work. It's so central as a regular part of our practice as historians to make sure that this is a priority. For my work on the bathhouse raids, I interviewed 30 of the men who were arrested to get their firsthand experiences, to see how they felt, what did they see, what did they hear, and then how did it affect them afterwards? What did you do the next day? And really hearing those stories of, I cowered in my bedroom for 12 hours under a pillow, scared to death my wife was going to see it on the news, that kind of thing. That's not going to be captured in the archive. So getting that story, getting those stories, really, really central to this. I also had a chance to interview one of the police officers who was responsible for raiding the bathhouses. So that was a really unique experience. And you can think about the archives of institutions. There are huge gaps in what's there, right? So the what we see in a police archive is such a small part of what actually goes on within those institutions. So being able to interview one of these police officers and to really get a firsthand account of what they thought of it, and whether they agreed with it or not. I mean, it was such a really cool interview that I was able to do. Never would have been able to capture that in an archive. So doing this oral history work, especially for histories that have been historically neglected, histories of marginalized communities, histories of communities that have had to resist, is really, really important that we do this oral history work to be central, in addition to the archival work. So when we think about HIV/AIDS, we really need to ground our histories in with the experiences of those who directly fought back. So people like who are in the AIDS Action Now in Toronto, and people who are in other organizations. ACT UP is another really good example of that. We really need to capture those stories. How did you organize this protest? We in the archive, we have the pictures, the photographs of the protest, but we don't know how it got pulled together. And so getting those stories down, really, really important to that. So this has inspired a lot of projects in this field. And I'll just highlight one, if I could plug one from Toronto in Canada, the AIDS Activist History Project. You can Google it. It doesn't have a cute URL that I can give you, but if you Google AIDS Activist History Project, you'll see that site. And that site has a collection of digital archive. So it's got your photographs, it's got your protest flyers, and whatever else. But it also captures the other side of it. They've published dozens of oral history interviews where they've actually spoken to activists on the ground from the 80s, 90s, into the present about their experiences being an AIDS activist. And this covers across Canada. So it's not just a Toronto-based project, but a national one. So this kind of work of collecting the archive, collecting these materials, these documents, these images, but making sure that's paired with the collection of oral histories has really been a model for my work. And I've tried to do that in my work on the bathhouse raids, and now I'm doing that in my work on this.
You gave me so much to think about. I had to take like scrupulous notes because I mean, part of the thank you for that, Tom, and thank you truly for all the recovery work you're doing. I mean, it's as you noted, right? If it's not preserved, it's lost, and then it's possibly then rewritten. Like this is part of the danger. It's a slippery slope, and it's so much more than just collecting art. You're creating archives. Like that is like how do you tell the histories of people whose stories were literally never meant to be told, that the government had no interest in preserve. And you're right, even some of the nuances there of like how did this protest come to be, or how did these people, like that is, we might know it happened, we might know it took place, but just on the surface, the kind of it could serve as a guide, right, to understand where we are today if we better understood how folks have done this. And some of it sometimes is the basic things, like how did we get people to agree on where we should meet and why we should meet there. And I love thank you for the plug. And if there's ways we could promote it further, please can let us know. And it's one of the reasons we're doing the Miami AIDS Memorial Project, is doing that project on the White Party, is that we have these great photos and these great, documentary evidence of being. That's like Darius Bose's work, evidence of being, right? Thinking about art. but we don't know why people dressed the way they did or like what kind of thought process. And those are such an important part of this story that exist in our collective memories as a community that otherwise just can't be told. So just as another plug, we're doing plug on plug on plug, but for folks who want to participate, it's in the chat as this gets restructured. You've given us so much, Tom. So I'm just, before we kind of open it up for folks, if they have questions, if there's, as we wrap up, if there's any other resources, spaces, or information that you'd like to share with folks, and how they could learn more about the work you do, the history of LGBTQ Toronto and AIDS Action Now, I want to give you that space.
Yeah, it's like I'm really blessed to be able to work alongside these other scholars in Toronto that have done this work, like those who have been involved in the AIDS Activist History Project, but also another really this is a librarian, so a scholar of a different sort than us sort of historians, but definitely we would adopt him as a historian. His name is Don McLeod, and he's someone who actually was foundational to the running of the Canadian Lesbian and Gay Archives. And one of the things that he did over the years is he started building this chronology, these volumes of books that laid out the history of LGBTQ Toronto in a timeline. And they're massive. I mean, they cover all of these events through the 70s and 80s. And he's just published the third volume of this, and it's dedicated to the issue of HIV and AIDS activism. So the author's name is Don McLeod. The book was just released last week. I went to the book launch, and the book's called HIV/AIDS Activism in Toronto: A Selected Chronology, 1981 to 1990. It's not going to be like your typical book. There's no like solid thread narrative that runs through it. It is a chronology, but underneath each entry in the chronology, he's got all of the different sources, all the newspaper articles, all the community news articles that you can find, and archival sources as well. So anyone who wants to embark on this sort of work, trying to reclaim this history of HIV and AIDS activism, these types of resources are really central to our work, and I'm really grateful for them. I mean, it's such inspiring. Like we have a lot of inspiration in our field. Like that's something I mean, you're one of them. You inspire me, Julio. But you know, we've got all of these folks that we can draw on, that we can build on, and you know, people like Don McLeod, those involved in the AIDS Activist History Project, and the you know, your work here in Miami. It's all really inspiring.
I paid you to say that. No, untrue. Thank you, Tom. And same. And we all are grateful for you and the work you're doing. Also, I feel like as you gave me so many things to and check out McLeod's book, please, everyone. And I had so many notes for the last one. I forgot to also say, oh my God, you got 30 in there. That's an incredible. If you think about the amount of people during that, it's. I also just want. I don't feel like I said that enough. Like that is, and you also got different perspectives in terms of you got someone from the state that is the police. This is, thank you for the recovery work you're doing. So I want to make sure we got, if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask of Tom in the audience, or here's your chance.
I'm happy to ask a question. Hi, Tom. Thanks for being here. I'm Rebecca Friedman. I work at FIU with Julio. Um, so I guess, thank you for, I'm sorry I was late. I had another meeting I was trying desperately to get out of. But could you talk a little bit about, because I'm interested in oral history. I don't know much about the particulars, but if you could talk a little bit about some of the challenges of this particular kind of oral history project when it's so deeply personal. I mean, everything's personal, but particularly so, how one navigates that. Thank you.
I really wish I had the answer to this. It's really messy to navigate it. And I think it's also really particular in terms of the experiences of the researcher and of the interviewee. So the example that I provided earlier is, one of my first ever oral history interviews was me interviewing my grandmother about the death of my uncle. And listening to her talk to me about, how did they select my uncle's burial spot, and the her completely breaking down and trying to describe to me that process and how they went to all these different locations, and each time my grandmother getting more and more emotional about this is not the right spot for John. And that, like, hearing her voice and listening to this story, it's still, if this that interview was 20 years ago, and it still profoundly affects me to this day. And that's all of these sort of unique experiences that people have with this kind of topic that deals with grief, that deals with loss and death. It's going to have this messiness to it. There's not going to be a, a framework that or pathway that we can just fall back on and slip into. We're talking about deeply human stories. You don't have the luxury to go to some rote in that moment. You're in that moment as a human being, feeling this in that moment. And I think it's actually really important to let yourself have that feeling as a researcher so that you can feel the profound effect of what you're doing. So, yeah, I guess it's not a direct answer to your question, but really it's like the messiness of the process and
Yeah.
embracing it and not letting it stop you from doing
Yeah.
the work.
I mean, maybe since there aren't many of us, I'm going to just hog this up to answer you back. Um, I mean, I think maybe it is one of the beautiful parts of the research, right? Because it also allows you to not have to pretend to objectivity on some level, and I mean, well, maybe I'll turn it into a question. How does that impact the kinds of history you write, the kind of stories you tell? In other words, you know, I guess maybe we're no longer battling this idea of objectivity. Maybe we're kind of past that as historians. Although these days truth seems to matter a little bit more than it has in the past. So, how do you kind of navigate that? How do you make use of, it's kind of a terrible way to put it, but the kinds of sources that are so deeply personal that involve you personally, whether it's your uncle or whoever else, or your great great uncle, whatever that was, yeah, or whoever else, right? I mean, I think that's a kind of beautiful challenge.
Yeah, it is a beautiful challenge. It's I don't think you abandon objectivity, you don't abandon fact checking or like doing due diligence and cross-referencing your sources and all of that other stuff. Um, but there are limits to so-called objective history as well. Like if you're only going to rely on the things that you can double, triple verify everywhere you can find it, you are forgetting. Like, I'm sorry, objective history is forgotten history, right? It is a process of forgetting when you're making that decision. Uh, and it's also like, what is it that you're trying to get out of an interview? Like, are you trying to get facts? Are you trying to get, the dates and all these other things? Or are you trying to understand the impact on this, on the individual and on the community, but also how they handled that? Like, what did they do in the face of that? And those things, I mean, what is objective in that case? I just, I think you're right. Like, I think we're increasingly moving past it, but also not abandoning our due diligence aspect of it too.
I would also, that was super useful to think about it through those lens. And I would also just add, right, that it's we've always been invested in truth, obviously, and like that's it's not like 6 days ago or 6 months ago or 6 years ago we suddenly historians are always seeking out accurate and truthful histories. Like that is always at the center of the work we do, and we think about how ideas of truth, like when you're doing the way you put it, Tom, is marginalized histories have less evidence of being in the archives, and that's the like so that's the challenge, is that the oral histories allow us to create archives that otherwise were systemically erased from state records. It reminds me a little bit, if folks haven't, the late Horacio Roque Ramirez's work with Nan Boyd. It's an edited volume on queer oral history and the kind of unique method of doing queer oral history, like what makes queer oral history different from, and a lot of it deals with HIV/AIDS. And one of the things that they argue, just as like a method, is that the relationship between interviewer and interviewee is often blurred in different ways because there's an experiential thing, there's a moment of understanding, there's like this kind of you're meeting someone closer to where they are in ways that are about shared intimacies, like not with the person but with shared experience. And there's this really important argument. I think they're right, like there is a kind of distinct queer oral history method that is what we do in this kind of recovery work that's not exclusive or perhaps unique always to queer folks, but that the queerness of it is not an insignificant part of the story. Um, anyway, thanks for that, Rebecca. It's helpful. Matthew, do you have any questions? I know you're there. It's okay if you don't. We're not just, I want to make sure you got space.
Yeah, so I did sort of have one question, which uh, I'll try to like explain my question. So and I am not well enough studied to remember the names, but when you were talking about like the history of AIDS activism in Toronto, that there was, the group that worked with the government to get the funding, and then there was the group that avoided that. Um, like how did what were their strategies, and how can we learn from that? Like, especially like, um well, at least here in the United States, like we're just seeing a massive like withdrawals of funding for a lot of things. um so we're going to need to increasingly not rely on the government. So is there anything that you learned in that research that might be applicable in that regard? Which is a little bit of a stretch, but that was sort of my thinking.
Yeah, that's it's a really important question because uh who your friends are today may not be your friends tomorrow. And so, when it comes to politics, the government of the day might be friendly to your community, but the government that gets elected next, they might be hostile. So government and this is true, especially in Canada, it's played a very central role in the creation of LGBTQ activist communities because so many of our organizations now depend on these government funds. And you might think, hey, yeah, it's great. We want the government to support our community organizations. And it's awful when they claw that back. It's a direct attack on our communities. And we know what it means. We know it's not just about the money. It's about denying legitimacy and launching this direct attack on us. So these things are, by relying on government funds, we become dependent and we make ourselves vulnerable to those political changes. Similarly with corporations. And, I think that's another lesson that we're able to learn here, that in one moment when, gay is good, you're going to see the rainbows on all the banks and at Target and all these other places. But when it's no longer cool or fashionable, that support dries up, that money goes away, those sponsorships go away. So these are unreliable partners. And this is the central argument that AIDS Action Now was making in 1998, sorry, 1988. They were saying, AIDS community of Toronto, yeah, you're doing great work. You need to exist. A lot of our community relies on you, but you might be co-opted and maybe not intentionally, but it's possible that this reliance on government and corporate grants is compromising our politics. And in the process, especially when you're talking about the emergency of HIV and AIDS in the 1980s, there was no time to waste. There's no time for, cocktail parties with the cabinet ministers and the minister of health. Like, what are you doing? Our community's dying. So there's a really central role, I think, in this two-pronged approach that I mentioned earlier, because I if government grants are there, if corporate sponsorships are there, we should take it and use it. Use those financial resources as part of our tactics. But we need folks to keep us accountable. We need folks who are operating without all of that stuff to make sure that the central focus is on our communities and the people who need help the most.
So well said, Tom. Thank you so much. And I love too how you brought in, you made the parallel not just with government agencies but also with corporations. I think it's important. So often corporations get left out of that equation, but you're right, right? The your friend today may not be your friend tomorrow. Um, I also just want to plug if folks to Merle Beam's work, Gay Inc. is such an important. Merle also has a great article in the Abusable Past about like I don't know, they find like this like gay pride shampoo like in Target or something and then it like unpacks what that even means and it's so fascinating because it's like, I bet well Target's actually been a strange. Anyway, but all these kind of, consistent and inconsistent in their ways. But I am really proud of us because we met our like that is we didn't go over time. We were really good about it and I wish we could have another 6 hours with you, Tom, but I know your time is short with us. And I just want to thank everybody for being here today, but especially thank Tom Hooper for sharing your expertise, your insight, and your labor and time with us. So thank you.
Thank
Thank
you.
you for having me here, and thank you for your questions as well. It was great to interact with you guys.
Thanks. Take it easy. Thanks. Bye-bye.